Hello, my name is Conrad Williams. I'm a novelist and short story writer. Um, I write predominantly quite dark psychological crime thrillers and horror novels, also known as the uncanny or the gothic by those who like to wear their fig leaves. Um, I did a PhD by publication at the University of Huddersfield. And the main part of that PhD was the novel that I wrote about 10 years ago now, which is called One, post-apocalyptic novel, or an apocalyptic novel, depending on your preference. Um, and that was the third in a loose trilogy of horror novels set in the UK, which started in 2004 with London Revenant, which is a novel about a secret society or tribe that lives in the underground tunnels beneath London, and a guy who suffers from narcolepsy who becomes involved with them and uncovers lots of secrets about the city itself. And then that was followed by The Unblemished a few years later, which was a horror novel about an offshoot of human beings who were driven out of London during the fire of 1666. So it wasn't an accident. And they went into hiding for hundreds of years and decided to come back now to wreak their revenge. So it's quite a nasty little book about human people who look monsters who look like us but behave like insects. But the real monsters are the real human beings. Well, you can read it for yourself and let me know what you think. And then I wrote One, which was in response really to a book that I read in 2007, which just absolutely knocked me sideways. My third child was on the way, and I read The Road, which is one of the most brutal, horrifying stories I've ever read. And it really affected me because obviously, at its heart, it's a love story between a father and his son. Um, and as much as I enjoyed it, I was a little bit irritated by it because so many of these stories seem to occur in the United States of America. And I was thinking about this, and I thought, wouldn't it be good to write an equivalent novel set in the UK? And obviously, in the States, you have this massive um, country where you can just keep walking north to south. You could go, from the tip of Canada to the tip of Argentina is something ridiculous, like 9,000 kilometers or something like that. But obviously in the UK, it's a little bit more condensed, and I hoped because of that island mentality, I was hoping that it might be more claustrophobic. And claustrophobia served a great deal of the novel, the ideas that I was having. I wanted to write something that was very high pressure and intense and claustrophobic, and also I wanted to have the inciting incident, the extinction level event, if you will, which is never explained in The Road. But I couldn't explain what it was because I was writing the story from the point of view of my main character, Richard Jane, who was not there when the extinction level event took place, because I wanted him to be, obviously I needed to find some way of having him hidden away from this and protected from it. Otherwise it would have been a very short story. So I was looking around for possible ideas, and I thought, well, he could be a diver, a saturation diver, one of these insane people who works on oil rigs, or under oil rigs more like, deep in the sea, fixing stuff. Very, very dangerous job, but luckily for me, something that keeps him away from that crucial flashpoint when it happens. And the flashpoint, again, was something else that I was worrying about. I didn't want to do what other people had done. I didn't want to have nuclear war. I didn't want plague, although that might now be something that would be quite relevant. I didn't want a meteorite hitting the Earth. So I was. It took a long time actually to come up with something that was different. But I read by chance an article in the newspaper about gamma ray bursts. So I read an awful lot of stuff about this. Went to the library, got loads of stuff about it. I got in touch with a guy at the European Space Agency who was very kind to give me some information about them. And I thought, wow, this is it. This is what I'm going to use. It's going to be gamma ray burst. Essentially, it's the fallout from the death of a star. So a star at the end of its life explodes or implodes or whatever the hell happens. You can see I did the research really well. And the fallout, the kind of like explosion, goes in a very specific direction. And if you're in the way of that, you're toast. So that was what attracted me. I really liked that idea. But it became clear to me very quickly that obviously, because I was writing the story from the perspective of Richard Jane, who was not on the surface of the planet, he was deep underwater at the time it happened. When he comes to the surface and finds that everybody's dead, how is he going to know that it was a gamma ray burst? He could never know. He could never find out. So all of that information, as juicy as it was, I could not use. So it all had to be the characters wandering around, wondering what had happened. They could never really say with any great authority what it was that had killed off the human race. Anyway, so that was my starting point. And in researching this book, I had in my mind a guy called Alan Burns, who was my creative writing teacher when I was at Lancaster. I did an MA at Lancaster in the early 90s. And he was teaching there then. He was there for a short period, just a couple of years. And we had a good long discussion about the idea of what he referred to as OMAHO in novels, which is an acronym for one man on his own. And he said that it was not something that was possible to do. You couldn't have a novel in which there was just one character. His first novel, Europe After the Rain, he had one character who was in Europe post Second World War, and he didn't know how to continue with this idea that he'd had until he thought, well, he's looking for someone in all this destruction. He's looking for, I think it was his sister. And I, obviously, as a young 20-odd-year-old, was having none of this, and I thought, well, I'm going to prove you wrong. I think you can have an OMAHO, and when it came around to writing one, quite a long time later, I thought, well, this is my opportunity to show Alan Burns, who is sadly no longer with us, that he's wrong. So I sat down with the intention to write a story, well, called One, and very quickly realised that I couldn't do it, and I needed other characters. And obviously, you need to have that kind of interaction. You need to have other characters to bounce ideas off. You need other characters for drama and conflict. It couldn't just be one guy on his own. And similarly, I didn't know what my main character's motivation was going to be, because once he's survived this terrible catastrophe, got back to the surface and found all of his colleagues dead, and then getting to the mainland, all of the people on the mainland dead, what was he then going to do? And I thought, well, as in The Road, I wanted it to be a love story about him and his son. But obviously his son, being 5, was unlikely to be working with him on the oil rig. So he had to be at home. And I thought, well, where's home? Because if it's in Aberdeen, which is where this guy was based for the North Sea when he's working, it's going to be very quick that he discovers he's either still alive or dead. So I thought it would make it more of a torturous journey for him if he had to travel down to London. Obviously no means of transport anymore because everything's been fried, so he has to walk to find out whether his son has lived or died. And that kind of underpinned the story for me, that kind of love for a child, that kind of need to know what had happened to him, because there can surely the worst fear in the world is if you're a parent and you don't know what's happened to your child. So that gave me a really strong motivation for him to do the right thing and get down to find out what happened to his family. So yeah, research heavy at the start, to do with saturation divers and how a planet dies when a star explodes next to it, and lots of other stuff about, because the thing that destroys the planet also turns out that is a vehicle for something else, that then provides in the second part of the book a more of a thriller narrative. So it's not a zombie novel as per se, but there is a threat from an alien life form. Lots of research trying to understand how to tell this story with authority, and so that it didn't come across as just kind of like a a goofy kind of like adventure story that didn't have any kind of real research or background nailed onto it. I really wanted to write something that was serious and believable, and I think researching in those areas did give it a certain amount of authority. And 10 years later, when I started doing my PhD, I didn't know really how to then kind of retrospectively bolt on a kind of thesis to explain the novel. So I decided to attack it from the angle of creativity. The title of the thesis is Embers in the Ashes, Apocalyptic Fiction and the Creative Process. So I was able to refer to a few novels that had affected me greatly as I was growing up and formed the inspiration for the novel one, including The Road, obviously, but also the work of Ray Bradbury and Ballard. Sorry, I forgot his name for a moment. J.G. Ballard. And so going back to those books and finding the seeds of the ideas that I then was able to develop in my own story was interesting, and being able to talk about the creative process and about the things that matter to me when I'm creating a story and putting together different kind of conflicting ideas and trying to form a coherent whole from those different ideas is the challenge that most writers have, obviously, when they're putting together a substantial piece of work, and the idea that most novels aren't so much written as problems solved in the making of big pieces of fiction. So that was all very, very interesting to me, and the idea that you could write about something that is so devastating, and then try to leaven it with occasional flashes of humour, but the idea of this guy who is so driven by his need to be with his son again, I think, despite everything else that's going on in the story, gives it a humanity and the feel of a book that is driven by compassion and love, and so many of the things that we find go missing in the middle of a crisis. So I think it was important to keep hold of those and to highlight the best of what we are rather than the worst, even though obviously there are people who take advantage of situations like this. So as well as dealing with the fallout of a terrible natural disaster, he also has to cope with marauding bands of villains who are taking this opportunity, the end of the world, to fill their boots in terms of what they want to do, nihilists or people who are just determined to make the best out of things at the expense of other people. So all of these things were going on in my head when I was writing the story, but at its heart it is just a story about a guy walking south to try and find what happened to his son. And his son never appears in the book because how could he? I didn't feel comfortable about there being any kind of happy ending in terms of a reuniting of him with his son. It would be too convenient, and I don't think it would have been believable. But his son is there all the way through the book, because the way that his father, Richard Jane, the main character, the way that he is able to finish this journey and to go on beyond it, constantly searching throughout the length of the novel, is because he'd never ever loses hope. And that was the important theme, I think, for me in the writing of this book. Despite the fact that I did a lot of research, I think it's important when that you wear that research lightly and you don't kind of overload what it is you're writing with huge amounts of information to show how clever you are or to show how much work you've done. So yeah, that's the kind of background to the post-apocalyptic novel that I wrote, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.